So I recorded audio and I was kind of in the moment of thinking through the process of how I was feeling based on the series that I was reading at the time. And I feel like that came out such a huge mess that I wanted to do this. And I'm not sure if it's going to be the add on or if this is going to replace what I did before, but I guess you'll see based on the video, right? So yeah, I did a recording about my thoughts and feelings on a particular sort of trope. Yeah, I did a recording on a particular trope, and I'm still kind of, I mean, I'm a few days out of it, but I'm still feeling like I'm processing it because it just so aggravates me, and just the subject as a whole of using tropes in writing has become just this big nightmare for me that I know that I can probably rant for a very long time, because if I'm still feeling it days after, then yeah, I have a really strong opinion about using tropes in writing. And so I'm just going to break it down right now. When it comes to tropes, I can get that there are ways that they can be used. And so I will acknowledge that, yes, tropes can serve a purpose in storytelling, that it can maybe ease the process because you know the kind of trope that you are dealing with. The problem with that is it's a trope. So if everyone is using the same tropes because all these tropes exist, then you are not you are not actually creating anything of worth. And you are, you're essentially creating stories that are paint by numbers. And yeah, there might be little tweaks, but if I go into a book and I notice your tropes, then you've taken me now out of the story. And so it is a personal thing for me as both a reader and a writer that I just, I don't like tropes. And so the main trope that I picked on in the video that I recorded before was the one about the church as the enemy. And I just kind of wanted to clarify a little bit before we get into, the mess that that was. But it's not necessarily that religion is put into these worlds. I don't really care about what kind of religions that are created in fantasy worlds because they are fantasy. The problem that I have is the trope of using one specific religion every time. And even if you tell me that, well, it's a different god over that world, or it's a different goddess over that world, the imagery that you are using, the structure that you're using comes from one particular religion. And that's very much a problem when it's paired with a protagonist that doesn't even believe in religion. So that's really kind of the problem that I'm having. It's sort of my feeling of, you know, using the church as the enemy has just thoroughly created weak storytelling, because the motivations of the church don't stand out enough for me to believe that the protagonist is the only one that can handle and tackle the stories without you directly using that protagonist to talk down to me as someone reading this story. Because if I am someone who is a person of faith and I'm feeling very offended by this constant trope, and yes, I am actually a person of faith, so it is kind of an aggravating thing because I don't like being lectured to, right? So, you know, when you start insulting your readers, you kind of have a problem. When your readers start pulling out of your story because of the tropes that they continue to see, that's a problem. And that's really what I wanted to express. And I, you know, I know I didn't express it at that time very well because of, being in the point of processing. But I think I have decided I'm still going to put that out there because, it is my initial thought process in my initial response. And I do think that for the kind of rambling mess that it was, there is a few gems of understanding in there that, that goes to why I have a problem with it. So, yeah, just kind of look at it as the learning mechanism of a thoroughly frustrated reader constantly having to read of this same trope that comes up time after time after time after time. And I know like I said, I picked on the trope of the church as the enemy, but it's not the only trope that I've seen that gets me that aggravated. One of the other ones that is right up there is the misunderstood villain. Like I despise that wholeheartedly. So it's not just about faith because like I said, if it didn't use the same kind of imagery the whole time, I probably wouldn't care because that would be creative. And so if there's anything to take away with it, it's just the fact of I'm tired of the trope usage because I feel like the trope usage is taking away creativity, which is thoroughly important in the fantasy genre. And so yeah, that's how I feel. And I just wanted to put this, I guess, long add-on in front. So if you don't feel like watching after this, that's fine. As long as you got this point, I'm okay. If you listen through more, I thank you for doing that. So yeah, let's get started. Oh boy, it's another week, another episode of Let's Talk. So here's kind of what I'm thinking, or I guess there's a lot of things I've been thinking, but I kind of had a thought that I put on Twitter because I refuse to call it X because I think X is such a silly name. But I had a thought that I put on there because this morning I was reading a light novel that it's part of a series that I've really enjoyed, but it kind of, it took on the trope that I knew it would take on because this is a very sort of Japanese kind of trope thing that I see, but I also do see it in a lot of Western media. And yeah, it's something that's really been bothering me. And that trope, of course, is the trope of the evil church or just religion in general being the enemy. And I would like to go through kind of my thought process of why this trope is kind of bothering me. And it isn't just because I'm a person of faith. Like it kind of has a little bit to do with it, but not really. Like it bothers me more as a writer than anything else because what the trope seems to do is it it kind of gives a weak it gives a weak enemy, right? So here's what I mean by that. And forgive me if I talk a little bit slower or give, some kind of silence and whatnot because I'm not attending to, but I'm kind of thinking my way through the process without going back to the tweet that I did. But the trope of religion or the church as the evil enemy and why I think that it's kind of a weak trope. Like it's kind of a weak trope because we're now seeing it everywhere. I can't I can't watch an anime, I can't read a Japanese light novel without seeing the trope of the church being the enemy. And I'm going to call it the church because they use Christian or Catholic, I mean, but it uses Christian imagery to essentially create a version of the church that's fantasy. But we all know what they're talking about because you use priests, you use nuns, you use the structure of Catholicism. So we know who you're talking about when you do this. And so the overabundance of this trope, and I will now start including the Western because it's the same thing. The overabundance of this kind of trope as the church as the enemy, because, the enemy because the protagonists are usually people who are either agnostic or they're outright against religion at all. So it's sort of like it how can I say this nicely? Because there's a couple of things that comes off with these kind of stories, because it feels like you're being looked down upon if you're a person of faith, right? When you're reading some of these things, and that's an emotional thing. And that's kind of like the Christian in me that sort of looks at it and goes, you think you're smarter because you don't like religion, kind of stuff. And I can't help but snub my own nose at, the genre trope, because it's very irritating. But from the writing standpoint, I feel like it's a lot different for me. So it really does kind of irritate me more from a writing standpoint, because, when you have the church as the enemy, and at this point I've read a lot of light novels, and I've kind of watched a lot of anime. Oh, maybe, but certainly fantasy is my favorite genre. And, this is really egregious in the fantasy, because, you take the structure, you use the church as the enemy, and at the end of the day, the the reasoning behind the church being this egregious enemy, or this terrible enemy, it inevitably falls far short of what the story can be. And it always comes off as people who don't know religion, don't care about religion, but they're just using it as a mechanism to create a story. And I think the problem that I have with that is not necessarily, like, the problem is, it's not necessarily that they don't know what they're talking about, because I don't think that you necessarily have to know a subject that you're talking about. Like, my point or my problem with the trope is that it's very much a trope, and it's very much a silly trope, and it's very much not creative sort of thing. And so it's sort of like when every story has the same structure, has the same problem, has the same enemy, and the enemy always looks the same, even though you're trying to tell me that these are all different religions, but they all have a bishop, they all have a pope, they all have priests, they all have nuns, they all have crosses, they all have the same thing. you know, as a reader, I can't help but roll my eyes, because where's the creativity to be found? So yeah, that is definitely my biggest problem with the trope of the religion as the enemy, because we know who they're talking about, we know who they're picking on, we know why they're doing it, because obviously they're able to get away with it, and we also know that it's not really creative. It really isn't, because it's a weak target that you can pick on, and then you don't have to think about anything, because essentially how it works out, and certainly in the current series that I'm reading, it just seems like all it's about is a power grab. Well, what does that have to do with, what does that have to do really with the story? And what does that really have to do with anything? Like, how do you, I guess my problem really is sort of like, what is even the purpose of it, right? So I know I can be harder on stories. And I know that because I can be harder on stories, I sometimes have a problem kind of working through my thoughts. And I mean, absolutely, I would say, forgive me for doing this thing that is really off the cuff. But like, as I work my way through, as I work my way through this problem and process, I keep going back to the problem being that it's so uncreative. And, as someone who likes fantasy, I like reading fantasy, I love writing fantasy. And fantasy for me is one of the most creative genres, because you have no rules. You can write your rules. You could be as soft, loosey goosey, or as hard on your rules as you desire. Your world building can be anything, because it's fantasy. There are no real hardline rules. And so I guess what I'm really against tropes. And so like I'm picking on this one trope, but it's just because like for me it's just a personal egregious trope by virtue of the fact of it just shows me how creativity has been sucked out of fantasy as a genre. More so, well, I mean, should I say more so than, because I'm kind of having a hard time a little bit because one of the things that has, well, as I work through, because I no longer read modern fantasy, and I'm very picky about indie because I know the indie genre exists, and I know that there are some very good indie. I know that there's some very good indie books, and I'm working my way through trying to find them, trying to look for them, you know. But at this point, I kind of pick the things that are old, things that I remember reading before, and I don't really look for modern books because of this trope kind of problem. And it's kind of like the same thing with the girl boss. Like when you keep seeing it and it keeps poking its head out, when you keep seeing it, you get irritated, and then you stop reading the book, and then you get even more irritated because you spent money on the book, and now it's getting on your nerves because you're noticing these tropes time and time and time and time and time again, and then you cry for something different. Give me something different. And that's kind of the gist of the post that I put. You know, like where is the creativity? Where is where is the experimentation? Where is, the actual thought processes? Like I get it. It's easier to write a story and it's easier to fit the story into, or it's easier to, yeah, to fit the writing into a scheduled timeline, especially for traditional publishing, if you follow the tropey mold. But oh my God, that's such a problem. It is such a problem because it's sort of like, I guess at this point, I kind of feel like you're looking down on readers, because you're giving them the same thing every time and you're not trusting them to have their own mind, and you're not trusting them or even the authors to have actual creativity because everything must follow a trend. And then, you're saying it's a trend, but is it really a trend? Or is it just something that because it's the only thing presented at this point, people think that it's the thing that must be? Like I feel like that with I do feel like that with the fantasy light novels because like you have a lot of them that started as web novels and then they got picked up by publishers and they got published. And then you see like even the English versions, meaning like with English writers and things like that, like they're following that same kind of tropiness, because that's the thing that's being pushed and you're told that that's the trend and that's what readers want. And then you think to yourself, but I see a lot of complaints that that's not what readers actually want. And, and social media kind of makes things even worse because, you know, you have the influencers and, people that are propped up as specialists and, how much of what they're presenting is actually stuff that they do actually read because, a lot of garbage has been able to be pushed forward because of these supposed trends. So yeah, I guess when we when we go deep into my distaste for, you know, for things, it really kind of is down to tropes and how tropes sort of kill the creative process. And, that's not to say that there's not a purpose in tropes, because yeah, absolutely. Tropes do kind of have their place and they do kind of help move stories. And certainly I think if you use them correctly, if you use them thoughtfully, you can certainly make a very interesting story, even using tropes. And yeah, there are times where you can even break the tropes, but I've seen that as well, where, the trope of, the hero who's not actually a hero. And now I'm starting to see that almost everywhere. And so it kind of, even breaking the trope becomes a trope in and of itself. So, it just kind of, I guess it kind of gets me to thinking of how difficult the writing process can be when you want to present a good story. And, you know, I don't know, like it really does kind of bother, it really does kind of bother me, these constant use of tropes, because it takes the guessing work out of the storytelling. And like, I know I could go on and on and on, but I think I'm going to kind of end it here because, I don't want my mind to go too far into trying to create solutions or find solutions, because I think the only thing that could be is being careful with your writing process. And, for readers, I mean, what can you do as a reader? Because you don't know what's inside the book unless you get a chance to actually read it. And a lot of times, you know, I mean, especially like I say, yeah, a lot of times the enemy comes out much later after you've invested yourself in the story. So, like I'm gonna keep reading this one series that I'm currently reading, but I'm hoping that nothing else comes forward in terms of the bad tropes that it's going to make me stop reading it. Because I mean, there's a lot of series that I've stopped reading for that same reason. Like the tropes come in and it's like you could see it a mile away and you go, I know where this story is going, so I'm out. And so that really kind of is not, like, I would assume that that's not the place that writers want their readers to go to. And I'm not going to put myself as the average reader because I am probably more so picky, but I can't help but think about how many series have so much potential, and then they fall so far short because they rely on gimmicky tropes that they're told have to be in these kind of books. So, thank you for listening to my extremely messy video. The next one should not be as messy because I thought about it a little bit more, but this one I kind of wanted to get out before I went a little bit too far off the edge. So forgive me. And if you made it this far, thank you. Thank you for getting this far. And I will see you on the next video. Bye.